I felt his gaze the moment I walked into the bar. He was sitting in the corner, calm and confident, with a glass of wine in his hand. He looked 55, but his movements, his eyes, there was more magnetism in them than I'd ever seen in any man half his age. His smile was dangerous, the kind that made you forget where you were, who you were. I had no idea that night would change my life forever. The dim lighting of the bar felt like a stage, and every step I took across the room, I knew he was watching. I chose a seat by the window, hoping the glass would cool the sudden flush in my cheeks. But his presence was undeniable. Even with the distance between us, I could feel the pull, like gravity bending just for him. And then, he stood up. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Slow, deliberate. His confidence made the air thicker. By the time he reached my table, I was already breathless. He leaned slightly closer, his cologne, a mix of cedarwood and something darker, filling the space between us. "Traveling alone?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, with a rasp that sent shivers down my spine. His smile wasn't just charming, it was a challenge. "Escaping everything," I replied, trying to sound composed, though my heart was racing. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Then it seems I found someone I can escape with tonight." The boldness of his words left me speechless. Before I could respond, he motioned for the bartender. A bottle of wine appeared at our table, the red liquid catching the flickering light like something forbidden. "I'm Gregory," he said, pouring us both a glass. "And you are?" I hesitated. Something about him made me want to be someone else entirely. Someone bolder. But I gave him my real name, and the way he repeated it, slowly, savoring it, made me feel like it was the most beautiful word he'd ever said. We talked, though I barely remember the words. His voice was a spell, his gaze pulling me deeper with every second. He spoke about places he'd been, people he'd known, as if he'd lived a dozen lifetimes. And every story carried a weight, a hint of danger that made me want to know more. But it wasn't just his stories. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world. His attention was intoxicating, and the way his hand casually brushed mine sent electricity through me. "Tell me," he said, leaning closer, "what is it you're running from?" His question hit harder than I expected. I glanced at the glass in my hand, the wine swirling as if it held the answer. "Maybe I'm running towards something," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Then let's find it together." The way he said it, so simple, so certain, it left no room for doubt. And in that moment, I didn't want to doubt. The bar was nearly empty now. The air outside was cool and salty, and as we stepped onto the dimly lit terrace, I felt his hand on the small of my back. A gesture so subtle, yet it set my mind racing. "I know you're not here by accident," he said, his voice softer now, more intimate. "Fate doesn't make mistakes." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to unpack. But before I could respond, he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Do you believe in moments that change everything?" I wanted to answer, but the intensity in his gaze left me speechless. This was more than a conversation. It was the beginning of something I couldn't explain, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But deep down, I knew. This night was only the start. And what happened next? Let's just say, it gets even better. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. He spoke about his life, travels to places I could only dream of, a career that seemed larger than life, and a love for art that gave him a poetic edge. But none of that was the real allure. It was the way he told his stories, the quiet confidence in his voice that made you believe he could move mountains if he wanted to. His gaze, however, was what truly unraveled me. It wasn't just polite or curious, it lingered. It trailed over my collarbones, down my arms, and landed on my lips as if daring me to speak. And when his hand brushed against mine, even by accident, it felt deliberate. My breath hitched, and I hated how much I liked it. "You're not like most people," he said, his voice rich and low. "And what makes you say that?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent, though my heartbeat betrayed me. He leaned back slightly, studying me as if weighing his words. "You don't strike me as someone who runs from their problems. You seem like someone who confronts them." His statement caught me off guard, like a punch to the gut. "I'm not running," I replied too quickly, the lie as transparent as the wine in my glass. A knowing smile curved his lips. "No?" Then what are you looking for out here, miles away from everything? I wanted to answer, but no words came. Was I running? Was I chasing something? Or was I just lost? As the bar emptied, the atmosphere between us thickened. The music had faded into the background, and the dim lighting made every glance, every touch feel more intimate. Gregory leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. "Do you have plans for tonight?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 possibilities. My pulse quickened, and my stomach tightened. I hesitated, knowing that whatever I said would change the course of the evening, and maybe more. "No," I replied finally, my voice softer than I intended. He smiled, that slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good. Let's take a walk." The terrace was quiet, the world around us dimmed by the glow of the moonlight reflecting off the ocean. I could hear the waves lapping against the shore, their rhythm soothing but somehow charged, as if they echoed the tension building between us. Gregory led me down the stairs to the beach, his hand lightly resting on my back. That simple touch sent a spark through me, like a live wire brushing against my skin. "I always feel like the ocean understands more than people give it credit for," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "It's calm on the surface, but beneath, it's chaos." I glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. "And which one are you? Calm or chaos?" He turned to face me, his expression serious yet inviting. "Depends on who's asking." There it was again, that challenge, that unspoken invitation to step closer, to take the leap. My feet sank into the cool sand as we walked further from the lights of the bar. The darkness enveloped us, making everything feel more intimate, more secret. We stopped near the water, the waves teasing our toes. Gregory turned to me, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. "Do you always trust strangers?" he asked suddenly, his tone playful but laced with something deeper. I smirked, folding my arms. "Do you always try to charm them?" He chuckled, a deep, rich sound that made my chest tighten. "Only when they're worth it." His words hung between us, charged with a meaning neither of us dared to explain. I felt my breath catch as he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Why me?" I blurted out, the question escaping before I could stop it. Gregory tilted his head, his gaze locking onto mine. "Why not you?" The simplicity of his answer stunned me. No explanations, no pretense, just a quiet confidence that I couldn't resist. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, he let the silence stretch, as if daring me to take the next step. "I don't usually do this," I admitted, my voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "I know," he said softly. And just like that, the world around us disappeared. The noise of the ocean, the cool breeze, the stars above, they all faded into the background as he leaned in closer. "Are you scared?" he asked, his breath brushing against my cheek. "Terrified," I whispered, unable to tear my gaze from his. "Good," he said with a smile that was equal parts reassuring and devastating. "Because it only gets better from here." The next moment, his lips brushed against mine. It wasn't rushed or aggressive, it was deliberate, calculated, and impossible to resist. His hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. My mind raced, screaming at me to pull away, to stop before it was too late. But my body betrayed me, leaning into him, craving more. The kiss broke, but the connection between us didn't. He rested his forehead against mine, his breathing uneven. "You're dangerous," I murmured, my voice trembling. "And you're intoxicating," he replied, his voice raw. The beach felt endless, the night infinite. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The real question wasn't whether I'd regret this, but whether I could ever forget it. And trust me, you'll want to stay for what happens next. Because the night? It's far from over. We found ourselves on the beach under a canopy of stars. The world felt impossibly vast yet strangely intimate. Gregory held my hand, his grip firm but gentle, guiding me closer to the waves. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the sound of the ocean rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Every step with him felt like stepping deeper into something forbidden, yet I couldn't make myself stop. The moonlight danced across the water, its reflection shimmering like 1,000 tiny secrets waiting to be uncovered. Gregory stopped and turned to face me, his expression unreadable yet utterly captivating. "What do you want tonight?" he asked, his voice low and steady, each word carrying an unspoken promise. His gaze pierced through me, deeper than any words could. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, desire, and anticipation. But I didn't need to answer. My silence said everything. He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave through me. My breath hitched as his thumb traced a line along my jaw, slow and deliberate. "Let me be with you," he murmured, his voice barely louder than the waves behind us. "Even if it's just for tonight." There was no hesitation in his tone, no doubt. It was as though he had already decided that this was inevitable. And deep down, I knew he was right. The distance between us disappeared. His other hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer until I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. My pulse raced, and every rational thought fled. There was only him, his presence, his touch, his eyes locked on mine as if I was the only thing that mattered. "You're trembling," he said softly, his breath warm against my face. "I'm not used to this," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He smiled, a slow, devastating smile. "Neither am I. But some things, they're worth breaking habits for." Before I could respond, he leaned in. The first kiss was tentative, testing, but it quickly deepened. His lips were warm, his movements confident yet unhurried, like he was savoring every second. I felt my hand slide up to his shoulders, clutching him as if he were the only thing grounding me to the earth. When the kiss broke, we were both breathless. Gregory's forehead rested lightly against mine, his eyes searching my face. "Are you scared?" he asked, echoing his earlier question. "Not anymore," I whispered. He smiled again, but there was something different in his expression now, something darker, more dangerous. "Good," he said. "Because this is just the beginning." He took my hand again, leading me closer to the waves. The water lapped at our feet, cold but invigorating. I watched as he bent down, scooping up a handful of wet sand and letting it fall through his fingers. "Do you know what I like about the ocean?" he asked, his tone almost contemplative. I shook my head, watching him carefully. "It hides everything," he continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Secrets, mistakes, even people. You could throw anything into it, and it would swallow it whole without a trace." I shivered, though not from the cold. There was something unsettling about his words, something that made my heart race in a way I couldn't define. "What are you trying to hide?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. Gregory straightened, his eyes meeting mine again. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a half-smile, he replied, "Maybe nothing. Or maybe everything." The tension between us was palpable, an invisible thread pulling us closer together even as my instincts screamed at me to tread carefully. But caution felt impossible with him standing so close, his presence overwhelming every ounce of logic I had left. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. "You ask a lot of questions," he said, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. "Maybe I'm trying to figure you out," I countered, my voice steadier than I felt. "Good luck," he said with a chuckle, stepping even closer. "I'm not sure I've figured myself out yet." The moment felt suspended in time, the rest of the world fading into irrelevance. Gregory's hand slid to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't. His lips captured mine again, this time with more urgency. My knees felt weak, but his arms steadied me, holding me as though I might disappear if he let go. When we pulled apart, I was dizzy, my mind spinning. Gregory pressed a kiss to my forehead, his hand still cradling my face. "You're not what I expected," he said softly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Neither are you," I replied, my voice barely audible. For a while, we just stood there, the waves crashing around us. The intensity of the moment was almost too much, but I couldn't bring myself to break it. Finally, Gregory stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. "Let's go somewhere quieter," he said, his tone calm but insistent. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Every instinct told me that this was the point of no return. But as I looked into his eyes, filled with a mixture of desire and something far deeper, I knew there was no turning back. The night was far from over, and something told me it was about to get even more complicated. His hotel room was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the open window. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the space, blending with the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against my skin as I stared at the vast, endless ocean. Behind me, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards as Gregory approached. His presence was magnetic, commanding, and I felt it before I even saw him. His hand lightly grazed my shoulder, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver down my spine. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he asked, his voice low, so close that I could feel his breath against the back of my neck. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His eyes searched mine, filled with an intensity that was both reassuring and electrifying. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. "I'm sure," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips but carrying all the certainty I could muster. Gregory's lips curled into a slight smile, one that sent a rush of heat through me. He leaned in, and when his lips met mine, it felt like the world paused. The kiss was slow, deliberate, an exploration, a promise. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer as the distance between us dissolved completely. I could feel the strength in his arms, the confidence in every movement. His touch wasn't rushed, it was precise, intentional, as if he wanted to savor every second. When the kiss broke, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other's. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. The air between us was charged, every glance, every touch thick with anticipation. Gregory took my hand, his fingers threading through mine as he led me back inside. The room was quiet, save for the distant roar of the ocean and the soft rustle of the curtains swaying in the breeze. He stopped near the bed, turning to face me. His hands moved to my arms, sliding down until they rested on my fingers. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said softly, his eyes full of sincerity. "I know," I replied, my voice steady now. "But I am ready." The intensity of his gaze deepened, and for a moment, it felt like he could see every part of me, the fears I tried to hide, the desires I couldn't ignore. He raised my hand to his lips, brushing a kiss across my knuckles before pulling me closer once again. As his lips found mine, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more consuming. His hand slid up my back, his touch leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. I felt his fingers tangle in my hair, gently tilting my head back as his lips moved to my neck. I closed my eyes, losing myself in the sensation. The sound of my own breathing mixed with his, the heat between us growing with every passing second. My hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palms. Gregory pulled back slightly, just enough to look into my eyes. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I felt my cheeks flush, but his words didn't feel like flattery, they felt real, genuine. I reached up, cupping his face in my hands as I pulled him into another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. He lifted me effortlessly, carrying me to the bed as if I weighed nothing. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us. Every touch, every kiss felt like an unspoken declaration, a moment suspended in time. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, and the moonlight cast soft shadows across the room. Gregory's hands moved with care, his touch firm yet gentle. He wasn't just exploring my body, he was memorizing it, as if he wanted to etch every detail into his mind. I felt his lips graze my collarbone, his breath warm against my skin. My fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer as if I couldn't bear the thought of him being even an inch away. He whispered my name, his voice raw with emotion, and I felt my heart skip a beat. There was something about the way he said it, as though it was the most important word he'd ever spoken. Time seemed to lose all meaning as we lost ourselves in each other. The moments blurred together, each one more intoxicating than the last. Gregory was everything I didn't know I needed, his confidence, his tenderness, the way he made me feel seen, understood. As the night wore on, the intensity between us only grew. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty, just a connection so deep it felt almost surreal. When it was over, we lay together in the quiet, the sound of the waves once again filling the room. Gregory's arm draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my shoulder. I started, but I couldn't find the words to finish. "Amazing," he said, completing my thought. I turned to face him, my fingers brushing against his cheek. "You make me feel things I didn't think I was capable of feeling." He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest ache. "And you make me feel alive," he replied. The room grew quieter, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. But even in that moment of peace, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this wasn't just another night. This was something more, something that would change everything. The room held its breath, as if the air itself was charged with electricity. The soft rustle of the curtains moving with the ocean breeze was the only sound, save for the faint rhythm of the waves outside. Gregory was standing so close behind me that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, even though we weren't touching. Yet. I didn't turn immediately. I let the moment stretch, the tension between us thickening with every passing second. My hand rested lightly on the edge of the balcony railing, and I stared out at the vast expanse of the ocean, trying to steady the storm raging inside me. Then his hand brushed mine, the lightest of touches, but it felt like lightning striking through me. His fingers lingered, then slid up along my arm, tracing a deliberate path that left a trail of goosebumps in its wake. "You're holding back," he said softly, his voice low and intimate. "But you don't have to." I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. His eyes met mine, intense and unwavering. There was no question in them, no doubt, only certainty. Certainty that this moment, this connection, was inevitable. His hand cupped the side of my face, his thumb brushing across my cheek. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my gaze flickering down to his lips and then back up to his eyes. "I'm thinking I don't want this to end," I admitted, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth. His lips curled into a small, devastating smile. "It doesn't have to." He closed the space between us in one smooth motion, his arms sliding around my waist, drawing me closer until I could feel the strength in his hold. His touch was firm, yet careful, like he was afraid to push too far, too fast. For a moment, we simply stood there, bodies pressed together, breathing in sync. His hand moved up to the small of my back, tracing slow, deliberate circles that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're trembling," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe I'm just nervous," I replied softly, barely able to get the words out. His fingers tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his gaze. "You don't need to be," he murmured. The room seemed to shrink around us, the rest of the world fading into nothingness. Every touch, every movement between us felt magnified, like the moment was balancing on the edge of something unspoken. He guided me back into the room, his hands never leaving me. The cool air from the open window brushed against my skin, but his warmth enveloped me, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. At the edge of the bed, he paused, his eyes searching mine for any hint of hesitation. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as though the question itself was sacred. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He placed his hands on my waist, his fingers slipping just under the hem of my dress. The fabric bunched under his touch as he guided it higher, every movement slow and deliberate. My breathing quickened, matching the thundering rhythm of my heart. His touch was confident, yet there was a tenderness to it that made my chest ache. He wasn't just rushing to some inevitable conclusion, he was savoring every second, every reaction, as though he wanted to memorize the moment. The silence in the room was almost deafening now, broken only by the sound of our breathing. The way he touched me, the way he moved, it was as if he knew exactly what I needed before I did. When it finally happened, it was beyond anything I could have prepared for. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just the feeling of barriers breaking down, of letting go completely. He was everything I didn't know I needed, attentive, experienced, and so present that it made me feel like the only person in the world. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, every moment blending into the next. Time became irrelevant, and the only thing that mattered was the connection between us, growing stronger with every passing second. When it was over, the room felt quieter than before, as if it, too, was catching its breath. Gregory lay beside me, one arm draped across my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "You're amazing," he said softly, his voice carrying the same weight as a confession. I smiled, my eyes closing as I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "You make me feel alive," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. His hand stilled for a moment, and then he pulled me closer. "You deserve to feel that way every day," he murmured. The night faded into a hazy dream, the warmth of his body against mine lulling me into a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. But when I woke up, the bed beside me was empty. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, and the sound of the ocean seemed louder now, more insistent. On the pillow next to me was a folded piece of paper. My chest tightened as I reached for it, already knowing what it would say. I unfolded it, the words hitting me harder than I expected. You gave me a night I'll never forget. But I have to go. You deserve more than I can give. I hope you'll always remember this. I sat there, the note trembling in my hands, as the weight of the night before settled over me. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a strange mix of gratitude and longing. What we shared was fleeting, but it was real. And it would stay with me forever. And now, I have to ask, what would you have done in my place? Was it worth it, even knowing it couldn't last? Let me know in the comments.